What a thrill to be here and see so many familiar faces. I've been here before trying to get this library off the ground. My first few visits, I was still having to swallow all my secrets, that I'd done all these tapes and that I was going to be slower than the people had any reason to expect I would about doing my own oral history, and I couldn't tell them that I'd already done all of this stuff. Now, at last, I can spill all my secrets, if not in the book, to you about how it happened, and at least some sort of sense and introduction about what it is and isn't, and share questions and answers with people who really appreciate where we might go from here with this history about this remarkable president. I know that I'm in the family here. He talked a lot about Arkansas in our secret sessions. I didn't understand everything he was saying. I was stunned, actually. He talked so much about internecine warfare with the Arkansas News and the Supreme Court and the owners and this, that, and there are several quite vivid passages in here that have already gotten me in trouble. That I was stunned when a reporter from the Arkansas paper came and interviewed me, and then the story today is perfectly nice. So I don't know how you guys manage all your blood wars down here. There's a lot of Arkansas in the book. He's telling me stories about some guy from Arkansas who refused to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom because Lincoln was a Republican. About his pilot who was staying with him upstairs in the White House that had stolen the flight plans of his opponents during the campaigns and that Clinton would fly ahead of them. He told me about the funeral of some guy named Hillary Jones in Newton County, and it went on and on and on, and that he had a standing order that he had to go to the funeral drunk or sober, no matter what, so that he could tell Hillary Jones stories. One I didn't put in the book because it was too complicated. He went through some arcane election when he was just getting started running for governor, and he said Hillary Jones called him up, said he knew he was going to win. He'd already gotten the boxes from this place and that place, and he says, "You're going to win, but I'm really mad about something." And there was some obscure box, and he said the tally was 64-10, and it should have been 66-8. The Smiths double-crossed us. So we had all these Arkansas stories. They're all through here. I'm going to read you a tiny section of just one. This is from the middle of a session. We're recording secretly up in the residence. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we were talking about China and landmines, Chinese landmines, and somehow he got from there to the Dallas Cowboys. Skipping over 2 gruesome car bombs in Algeria, I asked about a recent ceremonial visits from championship sports teams. The Dallas Cowboys managed not to tear up the White House, he said. They behaved like gentlemen, to befit the team's many Arkansas ties. An assistant coach came from Arkansas State, and head coach Barry Switzer had grown up under harsh deprivation in the last Arkansas county with an active Ku Klux Klan, said Clinton. Switzer's father had been a bootlegger. He ran into a tree and killed himself in a car chase, leaving the home of his black mistress. Left behind, young Barry was rough cut and quiet, but he was a lot smarter about football than sports pundits commonly insinuated. His players, no less than the president himself, were flabbergasted by a toast from the team's Republican owner, Jerry Jones. Clinton said Jones had bought the Cowboys with money made drilling oil in Arkansas on licenses from Clinton's arch nemesis Sheffield Nelson, who presumably kept him steeped in the most lurid Whitewater allegations. Despite all that, Jones pronounced the Clinton good for the Cowboys and said that they must get him reelected to keep winning Super Bowls. This amused the president. And if that's not enough, I was standing outside the Peabody about to come over here to be picked up to speak to you people, And there's a big to-do over there for the medical school, and a lot of fancy people were showing up, all dressed up. Some guy gets out of the car and sees I was carrying this book because I was going to read a little from it. And he said, "Do you know where I can get hold of the author of that book?" and I wasn't sure what to say, you know, so I said, who's looking for him? And he says, "Well, I'm Jim Guy Tucker, and I'm all in this book." And he said, so he said, "You know, I go way back with Clinton. There's a lot of stuff that's not in your book." And he wanted to find out what was, and we had a great old talk right there. I finally owned up that I was the author of the book. And so you are quite some small state, as the president never ceased reminding me. What is this? I do want to have some serious, a little bit of serious talk about what it is. It's not a judgment. It's not like my other histories, in which I take full responsibility for trying to bring to readers in perspective a narrative storytelling, but what I think are the significant interpretive facts you need in order to feel and understand the civil rights era in the United States. That's not what this is. When he asked me in 1992 as president-elect to move into the White House, essentially, and be an Arthur Schlesinger, I said I thought that was a bad role, even for him, that you can't really control the history about you. You can't have, in this day and age, a court-appointed historian to give your version of events, that it wouldn't work, that it would be suspect, and that I was committed to finishing the Martin Luther King anyway, so I wanted to do that first. And that I wouldn't, if I sat in the White House for 8 years absorbing material about him, I wouldn't feel right trying to present myself as an objective analyst of his administration. And I don't do that in this book either. First of all, it's too soon to do something like that, any sort of historical appraisal. And second, after sneaking into the White House for 8 years into the residence and taking and recording these sessions, I was far less objective than I was to begin with. First time I saw him, I told him I didn't fully vote for him in the primary because I hadn't seen him for 20 years, and I thought that his forgotten middle class sounded too much like Richard Nixon's silent majority. He laughed. He got a big kick out of that. So this is not a historical appraisal of Bill Clinton or of his presidency. Rather, it is a primary record. It's a glimpse of the two things that he wanted to be on the record for posterity that he thought were not part of the record in either the government records or in the contemporary newspapers. That his memories of things that would perish with him should he die, and the stories of what was going on behind the scenes that he wanted. Those will be available one day, I hope, in the library right here in full verbatim glory, with a lot more detail about Arkansas than I could ever remember or present here in the book. Secondly, so it's a primary record of a lot of revelations from the president that eventually will be grappled with in detail by historians. Secondly, it's a trip into the White House all these times on my shoulder to try to convey some of the experience of what it's like to gather this material. I was wrestling history too as a historian, unsure what to do. These are secret recordings. I'm very proud of the fact that we kept them secret for 8 years. That's no mean accomplishment in this day and age in the White House, his White House or anybody else's. But what we were trying to do was to lay this groundwork and to be with a president and watch him cross-filter with his astonishing mind all of the things that were going on. At the same time, he'd get a phone call about whether to launch airstrikes in Baghdad, and Chelsea would come in for help with her homework, And Hillary came in once to talk about a dream she just had about Henry Kissinger. You never know what's going to happen. You never know when you're going to leave. You never know when. A lot of times he would ask me to stay over. A lot of times he would be dead tired. He had his eyes filter up under his eyelids a number of times while he was still talking. He was allergic to everything. I would say, "Are you okay, Mr. President?" And he'd kind of come out of it, but keep talking, keep cross-filtering, analyzing, puzzle working, taking things apart, trying to mix together his analysis of the world with his personal assessments of people, which he felt had to be in combination to get anything done. You had to know how they ticked, and you had to know how the world talked and how the people ticked, and put them together. He at one point said that his greatest failure was that he could not make a personal connection with Jiang Zemin, the president of China. That became a running theme all the way through. So this is a primary record, and for the future, a glimpse of it, and it's a personal experience. I was wrestling because I didn't know what my role was. There is no precedent for it. Because it was secret, I couldn't peer group it and say, what question should I be asking? I couldn't do anything. I was flying by the seat of my pants. I knew that my primary role was to stimulate as much authentic storytelling as possible, and I would try to change the subject whenever I sensed he had gone into automatic pilot or wasn't saying anything new, but not because I thought one subject was more significant than the other. If I thought the president was really engaged in telling a story, I thought that was something future historians should hear. But what do I do if in the middle of a story he says, "By the way, do you think I should fire the CIA director?" Which he did, and lots of other things. Well, to say, "Mr. President, I'm just here to ask you questions and get on the record," I was worried would have deflated this exchange, because to some degree it depended on our rapport. He didn't want me just to sit there and answer questions. To some degree it depended on our relationship and even on some give and take, and there were times when I thought he was baiting me into being his conscience. There were other times when I thought it was downright uncomfortable, and he baited me even into arguments. But in that situation, I thought my role, look, I'm a citizen, I'm a historian. If he asks me for advice or he asks me questions, I have to give him my best advice. But if he gets so mad that he stops having the oral histories, I don't want him to do that either. So I'm wrestling history too as to what my role is. He's wrestling history in the sense that he overtly said, and I think this was part of the bond between us that got this project going in the first place, that he and I, as white Southerners who came from non-political families and grew up in the civil rights era and were converted against our will into political obsession by the transformation of that era, that our mission and his mission that he thought I would understand and therefore want to help with the history of was to restore something like a more objective appraisal of the capacities of politics to transform and work miracles in a free society. That he thought politics from our era, the civil rights era, for all of the upheavals and fear that we went through, had transformed the South, and through the South, the country and the world for the better, in ending segregation that had plagued and terrorized this region and paralyzed it. It not only liberated that scourge, but it liberated white people. It liberated our economy. It created the Sun Belt. It destigmatized white Southern politicians so that they could be two parties and run for president. It liberated women. It set loose all kinds of things that we take for granted today. And by any objective appraisal, the dominant political idea of the two generations since should be that our patriotic politics, that our government and our politics, when we work together, can still do miracles, which is the patriotism of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and everybody else. Instead, we have the remarkable dominant idea that, as Clinton put it, the government can't organize a two-car funeral, and that it is patriotic to disparage politics, politicians, and government in general. He loved politics. He wanted to lift the scourge of cynicism that he thought had so distorted American politics. And toward the end, we had some very, very raw and painful confessions that in the end, having worked to build a record that eventually will be reevaluated by other historians to show that he lifted a lot more cynicism than he got credit for and that we realize yet, or it certainly gave the basis for it, he still forfeited the chance to really turn the cynicism away by handing his enemies the weapon of cynicism in the scandal that led to his impeachment. And he will live with that, but the rest of us have to live with what we do to recognize the record against cynicism that he achieved. It is remarkable. Now, our friendship grew out of, the reason he chose me is because I wrote history, but because we had some little sense of personal life from 20 years before. He and I were sent to Texas to manage the McGovern campaign in 1972. I have been asked many times by people if I knew after that experience. We got an apartment together. He asked if he could bring his new girlfriend, Hillary, and I said fine, and the three of us had an apartment. We didn't see each other very much because we were like water bugs going all around a huge state, getting our butts kicked. People asked me if I left Texas thinking, did you realize he was going to be president? I said, are you kidding? We lost by 30 points. I didn't think either one of us would be dog catcher. But he did love politics, a lot of wonderful memories coming out of that period. His overriding memory, he baited me all the time. He said that I got to go to the LBJ Ranch when Johnson finally and tepidly endorsed George McGovern at the end. I didn't get any closer than that camera, but at least I did enough to say that his hair was longer than a hippie's in 1972, not long before Johnson died. My abiding memories are more prosaic. Bill Clinton suggested when we went there that we divide our duties in half, and that he loved union leaders and politicians and meetings, but that the overriding task that really deserved the greater talent and the bigger challenge was fundraising. And Taylor, you ought to take over the fundraising and I'll handle the politics. Well, that was just the beginning, because once I started doing the fundraising, which was a thankless task in Texas, to look for Texans who were for George McGovern in the height of the Vietnam War. Once we had to fire somebody, the first time we had to fire somebody from the campaign, he came to me and he says, well, here's how I look at it. We're trying to cultivate goodwill here in the state. And that requires morale on the staff. Most of the staff already hate you because you're already telling them that we don't have any money to do the stuff that they want. Therefore, it seems to me that it's more efficient if you fire the people that need to be fired. And what could you say to that? You know, it seemed perfectly logical to me, and after that I became the designated firer. When we left Texas, I went back to Washington. Hillary finished law, they both finished law school, and then Hillary came to Washington too. So I saw much more of her. And in fact, we had lots of lunches that she's somewhat sensitive about. I mentioned one of them in the book. On inauguration night, I reminded her of our lunches because the perpetual topic was, will she go down to Arkansas and marry Bill Clinton? And here she is, a Chicago Wellesley graduate on the Nixon impeachment committee in the House of Representatives in the Klieg lights of history. And he insists that if they have a future, it's going to be in Arkansas. And she kept saying to me, as I reminded her, she said, Taylor, have you ever been to Little Rock? And when I reminded her of that as First Lady, she says, Taylor, you can't tell that story. You know, that's going to cause me a lot of trouble. And I said, Hillary, people will understand. This was 1973, and you're up there in Washington, and this guy wants you to hitch your star to a place that you've never been. They will understand that. And she says, no, they won't. So I don't know whether you do or not, but that was the truth. But the larger point of congruence between Hillary and me in those days was that we were more typical of our generation, that we were disillusioned by politics. We had gone through 2 elections in which we thought we voted against the Vietnam War, and 40,000 Americans and over 1 million Vietnamese were dead, and it was still going, raging. The civil rights hopes were vanishing in riots. There was a division and polarization that presages the polarization that we still have over the 1960s. Hillary and I were a little more typical of our generation in the sense that we were close to dropping out or doing something different. I told the president before I left, told Bill Clinton, my buddy, we were both 25, that I'd had it with politics. I wasn't going to do any more campaigns. That here we were in the middle of this war with everything at stake down there in Texas, and all we did was referee disputes over who sat where in the motorcade between petty Texas politicians. And he remembered and therefore I'm going to go into journalism. There's more integrity in the written word. And I can't put up with politics and politicians anymore. And he remembered this, naturally. He also remembered what he told me. When he told it to me in 1972, I thought it was just pure ambition talking, and that he was blind about the faults of politics. He said, Taylor, if you want to accomplish anything large in the world, you have to build up your patience for squabbles over who sits where in the motorcade. You have to work through human nature and not around it like you writers. Later on, I decided that he had more wisdom and idealism in his political career than most of the people that I knew who were writing about him in today's media. A lot of that is recounted in the book. It's a personal story and a political story. It's a mix of family, of president, of Chelsea, of politics all over the world, of wars, of statesmen, of tears and funerals, the private side of, he knew every bus stop in Israel. He knew the ins and outs of monarchical, dynastic struggles in the Jordanian monarchy, why King Hussein had to depose his brother. He knew all of that stuff. He loved it. He loved politics from every angle, the strategy, the numbers, the statistics, meeting people, connecting with people far beyond the capacities that I saw in Texas. You could still see it in the White House, even in the crucible of all he went through. And I think that you'll see it here in vivid human terms. I don't know what kind of feedback you guys have been getting from the Clintons about this book. If somebody had written this book about me and my family, or a similar book, I would be cringing on a bridge to jump off of somewhere, because it is difficult, and I understand that. And when I took him the proofs for this book just a couple of months ago at Chappaqua, he said that the book was his idea, and I knew you were going to do this, but I didn't know you were going to have all that. And I don't blame him. I think he's, and Hillary too, are waiting to see how, as Miss Morrison put it so kindly, the unvarnished truth that's not being written to glorify, but to try to have a composite picture, is going to settle in history. My wife tried to get me to take all the stuff about Chelsea out, because she had worked for Hillary and knew how much they valued the president, their privacy. I said, look, Chelsea is is more mature than we are. She's no longer a 13-year-old girl, which is how it started out here. And the stories about Chelsea and even Hillary about her Kissinger's dream and all of that stuff that may seem to be totally extraneous are really part of the flesh and blood that human beings run our government. Even in the most personal branch, the presidency, where all powers are vested, executive powers are vested in one person. It is personal, but that person is not a myth and not a cipher, and unless we have a human flesh and blood notion of them, we are shortchanging our own sense of history. So I kept in stories, including many that he's worried will be distorted and made more personal. One tiny example, there's a story about him saying that he admired Chelsea for pursuing her career in ballet, that she stuck with it for 10 years. And the reason he admired her is because he said she was 6 inches taller than most of the other girls. She was heavier, her feet bled after every rehearsal. She stuck with it. She was more naturally gifted for many other pursuits. And he said, I have never pursued anything in my whole life that I wasn't naturally gifted for. I knew that I was gifted in politics at the age of 17. And to pursue something just because you love it exposes you to failure to a degree that you don't expose yourself to if you stick with things that you're gifted for. Chelsea stuck with ballet because she loved ballet, whether she was gifted for it or not. And he admired that. I put the story in because I think in context it shows you a side of him talking about that when in the next sentence he might be talking about Osama bin Laden or negotiations with Newt Gingrich. But overall, it shows a rounded portrait. But it can be taken out of context, and if you read somebody that says this book proves that Bill Clinton didn't like his own daughter's body or thought that she was awkward, you know, that's the kind of distortion that you would get. But to have a real history, you've got to take the chance for that. And I think that that's the way he pursued politics, and that's the way I'm trying to pursue history. It goes all over the place. There were uncomfortable moments, particularly the night before he invaded Haiti, announced the invasion of Haiti, and we had a session then, and he yelled at me and said, "This is the craziest thing I've ever done." Dale Bumpers came in and said, "I'll be impeached." My own best friends in the Senate say this is not even professional. You have 8% public support. You're invading a tiny island right before off-term 1994 elections. You are putting your own party at risk needlessly over an island that no one cares about. He says, "I'm going to do it anyway because it's the right thing to do. But I've never let the politics get away from me like this. I've got to try to figure out how to manage the politics so that I can get Americans a chance to care about creating free government in the poorest country in the hemisphere that has had tyranny for 2 straight centuries." Now, the fact of the matter is that he gave it a chance. The chance has not taken yet. He's still working on Haiti. The fact that we didn't care more about that than we did, and that it vanished, is on us. And what's even worse that's on us is that in the face of his decision to have that invasion anyhow, on principle and commitment to a chance for freedom in Haiti, totally washed off the back of most people who continued to say in mantra that he would never do anything that wasn't popular and that he had no internal convictions that he would take any political risk for. There are many other instances of that in this book that show how disjointed and unbalanced our sense of history is. In that sense, we're wrestling history too, to try to restore balance. Not a balance between left and right, not a balance between liberal and conservative. You need both, but the balance between hard questions and governance and taking citizenship seriously and reminding ourselves that from the very beginning, our founders said that democracy, there's a reason that it was considered impossible for 2,000 years, that it never is making any headway unless you're acknowledging that the decisions are hard and challenging and that you're thinking, and that it's an intellectual, moral, political, and social challenge. And I think the lesson coming out of this book is that that's what the president did. It's a voluminous record. It was an amazing adventure for me to be part of. I am proud it was secret for its time. It needed to be secret, but it was secret so that it can come out now. And I commend it to you, and I hope that the library will have the record in full, and that it will begin to spur what's inevitable, which is the long-term rehabilitation or the long reevaluation that follows every president for generations and centuries afterward. And I know all of you in Arkansas have a greater stake in that than most people, but really it's for and about the country. And I hope we can start as readers. Thank you.
Before we get into the questions and answers, normally I'm not surprised when people walk in the room. Yesterday, many of you were here to hear Michelle Rhee of the Washington, D.C. schools just do a fabulous job. Walking in this room 5 minutes ago, and I don't know why he's here, but I'm glad he's here because he was here speaking, but he's now here listening. I want everyone to meet the mayor of Sacramento, from the former Phoenix Suns, known as KJ, Mayor Kevin Johnson of Sacramento. Taylor, there are a lot of people that like your book, and people come from Sacramento to hear you. So now, and KJ, we'll talk in a minute.
If you do raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you and get questions. Bob, right there.
During the 8 years that you were interviewing him in the White House, were you limited to just interviewing him, or did you have access to other members of his cabinet and staff?
It was deliberately just him. He didn't want his other people to know he was doing it. So that's why the reason that we recorded almost exclusively in the residence. We had a couple of times early on when we recorded in the Oval Office and people were always barging in. And I was trying to hide my recorders because he didn't want me to show them. So, no, it was deliberately just for him. He didn't want most other people to know. I got schedules for a time from the scheduling office, and I'm sure some people there knew, and Nancy Hernreich knew because her office, she was my rabbi. She was the one that would ask the president, do you want to do another session? She supported this. She knew he wanted to do it, but that he was always tired and reason not to do it. But she would ask him, and her office would call me and say, can you come down tonight? There's a hole in the schedule. It was almost always last minute, almost always that day. And I would have been writing all day in the 1960s and grab my recorders and go down there. And often leave at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And the tapes, I had 2 little recorders. And I put them between us wherever we were, up in the solarium, in the kitchen, in the dining room, in this little parlor, and my favorite place, the treaty room, his office in the residence, because it's such an inspiring room to be in. So I'm sure some of you have seen it, but we would record there. When it was done, I would rewind the tapes and carefully label them, and I gave him 2 little boxes to keep them in. And of course, the boxes had to get bigger and bigger. So originally, when we started this, I was only going to do it until he trained somebody on the staff to do the oral history, but he never trained anybody, so we did it for 8 years. But our whole agreement was that we thought these things were safest if he kept custody of them as his private diary. We even discussed whether I might keep them because I would have a First Amendment, like I'm writing a book privilege if somebody were to subpoena them and go after them. But we decided it was best for him to have them so that he could control them and build his confidence that they would remain confidential so that he could be as unguarded and candid as possible. He still has them, and I never asked to see those tapes that have my voice and his voice on them, in part because if I asked in good conscience, he was always asking me what do I recommend historically. I couldn't recommend that he give access to me and not to every other historian, and I knew he wasn't going to open them now because Hillary's still in active politics. What I had was, as somebody who deeply believes in the importance of presidential contacts, I took that same little tape recorder when I left in my briefcase and popped another tape in it, and I had to drive home to Baltimore, and before I got out of the White House driveway, I was saying, it's 1:47 a.m. I'm leaving after session 57. It was unbelievable. We went from Bosnia to this, that, and the other. And I dictated everything I could remember, what he looked like, my reactions, what he said, the gist of it on the way home so that my own... So the Clinton tapes is a deliberately ambiguous term. There are lots of Clinton tapes. The ones he had that are verbatim for all of us, the dictations that I had that don't have verbatim what we said, but they do have other things, such as what was said off the tapes and when the tapes weren't running, and when Hillary came in, or when they were arguing about impeachment, or some things that weren't on the tapes. So that's what I did. But it was deliberately a secret process from the rest of his government. In fact, he was more worried about his own government leaking it than anybody else, which is why it was deliberately just a presidential project. There's nobody else on the tapes.
We'll go over here. Hold on. 1 second. Wait, hold on. Just wait for the mic. Sir, hold on. Hold on. Thank you.
How many sessions in that 8 years did y'all have?
We had, I'm saying here, we had 79 full sessions that went on. There were several that were aborted or that were too abbreviated to really count. Taylor, can you forgive me? I've got to go duck hunting, or things would happen that wouldn't get enough on the record to really count. But there were 79 full sessions that lasted anywhere from an hour to 3 hours on tape, and then a lot of other, time, social time on both sides. Toward the end, I had a hard time getting him to stop playing three-dimensional Scrabble with Hugh Rodham. Which I had never seen before, but it apparently is a very absorbing game.
Bob, right there.
Do you know of any historian or journalist that is doing an oral history or the type of thing that you did with George W. Bush or with perhaps for Barack Obama?
I hope so, but I sincerely doubt it. That's one of the reasons of urgency why I was so stunned when President-elect Clinton, whom I hadn't seen for 20 years, the first thing he asked me was about records. Did I think the records were getting better? From my own work, I think that they're getting worse and worse. Certainly they're not recording their telephone conversations. And what I found in the Clinton administration and in some of the administrations between President Nixon and Clinton is a growing bureaucratic resistance to human records, to real records. There's a pile of paper, but not very much flesh and blood. And they don't like notes. The egos of the White House staff have gotten, they were pretty big to begin with. But Bill Moyers, who has a very healthy ego, would take verbatim notes of the Vietnam meetings and leave them in the government record. Nowadays, and for a long time, it's considered beneath aides to do that. Plus, they think that anybody who is taking notes is a threat to them. And so there's ferocious resistance in the government to the kind of record that would enable the American people to understand how their government really works. And I hope Barack Obama is doing anything like what President Clinton did, but I don't know, and I am pessimistic about it. If it were up to me, the American people would be mature enough to have a debate about whether we should record all of these conversations and have them off limits for 10 years or 15 years or 20 years or whatever people wanted to say. But I don't think people would trust that we'd be able to keep our word. We'd find some reason that we just had to get in there and find out what was being said. But absent that, I fear that we will never know what was really said and done and how people felt about all of these things, from the hostage crisis under Jimmy Carter into Reagan, and Reagan's tax bills and his invasions, and what George W. Bush was really saying before and after we went into Iraq. I think that we're going to understand that only on the basis of massaged generalities and myth, and that we deserve better. And President Clinton took a huge risk to give us something better. But it would take a big political movement and education to try to establish something more systematic. People say, you know, he wouldn't get, if there were recordings, he wouldn't get good advice and that everybody would be inhibited. And we had big arguments about that. I said, Mr. President, anybody who won't give you any advice that they're worried about being disclosed 15 years from now is not giving you good advice anyhow. If they're so scared that they're worried about what people will think 15 years from now, forget them. But anyway, it's off limit. We're pretty far removed from having that kind of history, and I would doubt that any other presidents are doing the kind of thing. Even President Clinton called this remedial. He loved Lyndon Johnson. The very first paragraph of this book, I was terrified the first session that he was gonna do his own taping system, because he was asking me, how did Johnson keep it secret? But it took a lot of people to do that, and he finally decided to do this instead.
Here you go.
You characterized President Clinton as a man with an astonishing mind. Do you believe history will share that characterization?
Well, I don't speak for history. I tried to qualify myself on that, but I do. What I'm saying is that in here, I was astonished by the reach of his mind in these sessions, because I could see how tired he was and I could see how beleaguered he was, but the leaps and the connections and the drive to keep, he was a puzzle worker, to keep tinkering with these puzzles, whether it was Northern Ireland peace or the Middle East or Russia. I mean, people don't, Russia, there's been a lot of, the way he would talk about Russia was just thrilling to me. He'd say, look, the Soviet Union collapsed. There are no free institutions there. It's over 11 time zones. They're trying to build the first free markets, the first free institutions, in a political climate that is besieged by the mafia and by right-wing politicians that basically want to reconstitute the Soviet empire. Boris Yeltsin has the most daunting task of any world statesman I know, and his alcoholism is a lot worse than the press image of the Jolly Russian. And it was in that context that he told the story of, you know, Boris Yeltsin being waked up at the White House because Yeltsin has escaped Blair House across the street at 3 o'clock in the morning in his underwear, drunk, trying to hail a taxi to go get a pizza. And there's been a lot of attention given to that. And then he said the very next night he escaped again. He said it was worse because he came down the back stairs in Blair House. He didn't get out of Blair House, but it was only because he was accosted by some people from the Executive Protective Service, some agents who didn't know who he was. And then there were some Russian agents who accosted the EPS agents, you know, and then the Secret Service, he said we could have had a shootout in the basement, all because Yeltsin was drunk. But there's a lot of sensationalism about that, but the point he was trying to make had to do with this gargantuan task of creating free institutions in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he talked about that all the time and analyzed it at great length, and there were times when he consulted with Hillary about it, but it's just a small example. His mind was all over the place to me. I'm not trying to assess it, how it rates with anybody else's, but from somebody who had known him in our youth and saw him as a pretty good guy, but who was my peer, That kind of range was an astonishment that left me in awe at times. You're not used to being in awe of your own peers. And sometimes I wasn't, but sometimes I was, and it was when his mind was operating at that level about history and politics.
Go over here.
Taylor, my name's Walter Hussman, and I'm glad you liked the article in the paper today. I did too. I thought it was good.
Wasn't it nice? Yeah.
So, anyway, I'd like to say first I've got a lot of respect for all your past accomplishments, and I'd also like to say that as you know, our newspaper editorials and some of our columnists have been critical of the president. And despite that, and to the president's great credit, every time I've been with him personally or talked to him on the phone, he's been very polite and cordial and friendly, and I think I've reciprocated. But my question has to do with really attribution, your style and attribution and accuracy of your book. I was reading a very favorable book review in the New York Times by Joe Klein. But one of the points he made in there is that there was a problem with the book because everything was secondhand. And that sort of resonated when I read that because you directly quote me in the book. And unfortunately, we've never had a chance to meet and never had a chance to talk, but my statement is in direct quotes. And so I wonder about that as a literary style of attribution. Number one, and the number two, since this is a history, I wonder about accuracy. If I know you didn't contact me to try to corroborate or confirm or contradict anything that was said, you know, and I assume that's the same for you other people. So, for a history, is that as accurate as it could be?
That's a very good question, and I do want to address that. I think what I would say. This book quotes Yitzhak Rabin. It quotes all kind of people, but it's pretty clear. I think any fair-minded reader who read that episode, the reason I call this a primary record and not a history is that it's a record of Clinton's conversations. That's what Clinton said. And I was careful. What I tried to do on the basis of my recollections of his conversations, which, by the way, is what all journalism rests on. You have interviews, and you go out and you record those. That's what the stories are. That's what this is. This is my record of what President Clinton said. But I did not. To turn this into a history and have me try to verify what he said to 1,000 characters in the book. Would have made it an impossible enterprise. And I think fair-minded readers know that this is not me saying that that's what you said. This is what the president said you said. And my book is his record of what he said combined with my experience of taking it down and my reaction. So, no, there are lots of times when there are quotes, but more than quotes, just facts. He quotes, you know, what he played on the saxophone with somebody in a bar in such and such a place. No, I didn't go verify that or anything else. This is meant to be a primary record of what one day people will hear on the tapes, his exact quotation of his, or reconstitution of his conversation with you. If I misquote, if I get it substantially wrong, or if it's totally wrong on those tapes, then I will have to live with that. I say in the afterward, I am accountable for a faithful record of the gist of what he said. And I don't use quotes very much. In fact, I was criticized for not using quotes more. But to me, that's the whole thing of being reserved, that if I have in my notes the gist of what he said about incredibly complicated things, the Middle East peace talks, the subtle little things at the end he was trying to do with Barack and Arafat. I'm trying to give the gist of what it is, and I use quotations very sparingly when his account was so memorable that certain phrases, including the phrases that he said he spoke to you, stuck in my mind a half an hour later. He said to Walter Hussman this, that, and the other, which is why I have a sparing use of quotes. But you're absolutely right. If this is going to be judged as a history, which is what I didn't intend it to do, in which I am vouching for the accuracy of what President Clinton says he said, you know, I plead guilty. That's not what I was trying to do. It would have been impossible for me to verify that with the host of characters in this book. This is a record of the president, and it's not a historian's book.
We have time for one more question. There it is.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about these uncomfortable moments and specifically about when it started, about the intimidation of being in the Oval Office and speaking with the president, even though he was a peer, and how you had to overcome that, or what you tried to do to overcome that to record these sessions.
Well, thank you. These are all good questions. He helped me a lot. Bill Clinton is pretty gifted at putting people at ease. He would wear blue jeans and carry books under his arm and hug me. And I mean, he acted like we were old friends, but that we were doing a significant historical project that in a way we were meant to do, that I'd cared about presidential history and history all my life and records, and that he'd been trying to be president all his life. And so here we were together in this, and we will never have that kind of I think we'll always be friends, but we'll never have that kind of association again. So he did a lot to try to put me at ease. I say several times in the book that it struck me after a time that the moments when I was really most intimidated were not when he was there. Because when he was there, I was so focused on what the next question I was going to ask and on the task, it almost rescued me in the sense of helping me out. The time that I got goosebumps, and there were a lot of them, were when I was in the White House residence by myself, and he had to go do something else, or he hadn't come there yet, and I'm sitting there looking at rooms and art and mementos of presidents who've lived there since John Adams, and saying, you know, this really is significant. One day people are going to look at this, and this is a president talking about things that affect the whole world, and I'm here doing it, and my God, can't somebody else help out? So those were the moments that were most intimidating, just about goosebumps. Now, the uncomfortable moments, we had uncomfortable moments between us, and some of those are in here, where he would bait me, in part over Haiti. There was a slight undertone of Haiti because I cared so much about Haiti that, you know, you got me into this, Taylor. He never said that, but, you know, that was there. Then when he did the Middle Class Bill of Rights after losing the 1994 both houses of Congress, and this was one of his times when he said he felt sorry for himself and he was bitter, right out front. I put the country on a road to prosperity. I did my best, and my reward was to be branded, you know, a big government tax person, and I lose both houses of Congress. If the American people want somebody to tell them, to pander to them and tell them that government is free and that they don't have any hard decisions and that we can work our way out of this thing by having a party and borrowing money, I can do it. I'm going to give them a middle-class Bill of Rights. What do you think of that? Well, Mr. President, I don't think that's your finest effort. No, why not? What do you really think? And that was very, very uncomfortable. And he pushed me until I finally said, Mr. President, a Bill of Rights is a very fundamental thing. You don't have it for one social class and not for other social classes. And if you did, it wouldn't be a big, long string of tax cuts. And he's, by God, I can pay for my middle class Bill of Rights, and I'm going to do it, and so on. But I didn't know what was going on there. This was somebody writhing and very uncomfortable, and mercifully, the middle class Bill of Rights had a very, very short shelf life and didn't go anywhere. And we had another one at the end over his memoirs, because I thought he shortchanged the value of these tapes in his memoirs. And that's all in the last chapter. And again, he pushed me. Why? You know, what do you think? What do you think I should do? Mr. President, this is insane. You should have 2 volumes. This is not responsible. You could write such great memoirs if you wrestled with all these things again the way you did on the tapes and so on and so forth. Finally, and he baited me to be more, to let it all hang out there. And finally he looked at me and he says, Taylor, will you say all that to Hillary? So I said yes, and he calls Hillary down. This is up at Chappaqua, and I had to go through the whole thing again. So there were uncomfortable moments, but those were really over matters of substance in the few areas where I think he, apart from my ability to gather history, that he thought my opinion was worth something. Maybe not much. A lot of the times he would say, well, Taylor, that's why you write books and I do the politics, because you don't know anything about politics. He was perfectly capable of saying that, but on a few instances, we had uncomfortable moments over disagreements about matters where he was soliciting my opinion.